Welcome, everybody, to Moral Mayhem. Today, we're joined for the second time, our first repeat guest so far, by Garett Jones. Garett is a professor at George Mason University, and he's written a couple of popular books. The last one that we talked about a lot was The Culture Transplant, which talks about immigration with the core thesis that people matter more than places. And starting off this time, we wanted to discuss more in depth to that this time. So yeah, thanks again for joining us, Garett.
Yeah, glad to be here, Reagan.
Nice. So Garett, if you wouldn't mind, just even though we covered some of this last time, just
sure.
Giving people a brief overview of the central thesis of the Hive Mind, then we can go from there.
Yeah. So the central thesis is that being around smart people is more important than being smart yourself, and I think that this is sort of an obvious statement once you hear it, like people don't object to that. But where it becomes more controversial is where I say, I think this can explain maybe half or more of cross-country differences in income per person. So, differences in cognitive skills, whether we use IQ tests or standardized math and science tests, differ massively across countries. And I think that there really is a hive mind effect, a social multiplier effect, where if you put a lot of smart people together, you create something incredibly productive and magical on average. And if you put a lot of not so smart people together, you get a country where the toilets don't work.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I do agree with you that this is pretty intuitive when you think about it on the micro scale. We were talking before we started recording about, why do academics want to go to universities and be surrounded by other academics? Why do people move to Silicon Valley? There's obviously cultural and other reasons for that as well, but just people's observed behavior kind of seems to line up with the idea that smart people seem to value being around other smart people for some reason, whether it's productivity or otherwise.
Yeah, like the simplest economic model would tell you, well, gosh, there really aren't a lot of gastroenterologists and urologists in the world's poorest countries. So the gastroenterologists and urologists should all be trying to migrate to the places where they're really scarce. But obviously, they know it's pretty obvious that you're just not going to earn a lot going to one of the world's poorest countries in those fields. You want to be in a place where a lot of people are smart, who can be productive and offer a lot in exchange for your services.
And there's certain analogs of this. I think one intuition, analog of this that's a common intuition is the idea that highly productive people should stay in their home countries, right? The whole brain drain stuff, or that you should pair weaker students with super smart students. And I think sort of your especially the O-ring part of the thesis kind of dispels this notion, or at least provides one mechanism through which we can dispel this. Before we get into that, though, because that's something we want to talk about. The sort of central statistic you cite is a 1-point IQ difference in between individuals. Explains about sort of
one standard deviation.
Oh, sorry, one standard deviation is about 15% will give you about 15% increase in income. And the effect is much sort of larger at the level between nations, right? So
yeah, maybe 6 times bigger. Yeah,
6 times bigger. I was kind of reading a couple of reviews of your book, and one place where I found sort of pushback was this idea that, well, how do we know this is not just it's a statistical effect from aggregating up, that where sort of the errors cancel out and you just get the aggregate effect of people's IQ. How do we know that there's something multiplicative or nonlinear going on, right? And I think there's a very simple intuitive explanation, but statistically, how would you sort of reason there?
Yeah, statistically, the answer is that when you average out people's wages, that's not going to multiply the effect of the link between IQ and wages. So, for instance, there was one critic online who thought, well, the reason Garett's getting this result that IQ has very little effect on individual wages is because he's only using each person's annual wages. And each person's annual wage is measured with noise, which is true. It varies a lot from year to year, and people give the wrong answers to the government statisticians sometimes. But so if you average that out, that noise goes away. Totally true. But what the people who make that criticism don't understand is that doesn't affect the size of the coefficient. this is like a mathematical linear algebra point that I can't really explain here very easily unless I got a dry erase board. But just as a matter of arithmetic, averaging out many years of wages does not increase the magnitude of the link between one IQ point and a person's wages. My ballpark estimate before was that one IQ point, which is a 15th of a standard deviation, one IQ point raises a person's wage about 1% on average. If somebody wants to say it's 2%, I'm not going to argue too much.
And so,
wait, sorry. Do you mind if I just really quickly see if I can summarize the statistical misunderstanding of the reviewer? I think it's basically they're correct that when you average across a large number of people or a large number of years, the same predictor should explain a larger percentage of the variance because you're removing a bunch of the variance, but it won't increase the size of the effect of the coefficient. So significance will be easier to find, but the point that you're making about the size of the effect is not related to the averaging over lots of people.
Yeah, you said it better than I did. So if we think of high school algebra terms, it doesn't change the slope in the y equals mx plus b formula. It has no effect on the m in the mx plus b. It does have an effect on what we call the correlation coefficient, the r squared, those things that a lot of people learn in their intro stats classes. Those things will go up. But the coefficient, and that's exactly what this person found. This person went through all the trouble of taking many years of averages of people's wages and got mathematically exactly the same result for the slope. So I'm glad that, this is something they don't teach in a lot of college stats classes. They teach you to sort of worship correlation coefficients or r squareds or r's, which has a role. But this economists care about magnitude. We care about slopes a lot. And when I found out that the slope for the individual payoff to IQ was so much smaller than the slope for the national payoff to IQ, I knew I had a puzzle to solve. And that really kicked off my agenda back in about, I'd say 2006, 2007.
Do you think if you used, what do you think would happen if you used average IQ in the cross-country analysis, if you used average IQ instead of median IQ? Because you would think like there's some nonlinearity on, the right side of the tail or whatever, the top 5%. Yeah.
That's a great question, but there just aren't enough countries where the top 5% is so different that it would actually change the mean. It's hard to get a big gap between mean and median. Where there have been some people who've done statistical work looking at this, and Heiner Rinderman's one of them. He always does very clean, clear statistical work with results that I believe. He and others have found that if you just know the average test scores, they usually have to use math and science scores of the top 5% of the population. That's a better predictor overall for the planet as a whole than the average test score of the population. So, and they refer to this sometimes as the smart fraction theory, that basically the smartest people in the country matter more than the average person. The problem is that all of that statistical power, there are only a few countries in the world where the top 5% are just wildly different than average. So in most countries, the top 5% are, they're like 1.5 standard deviations, 1.5 normal standard deviations above the rest of the country. And in some countries, that top 5% is like way out there, like 2.5. Those countries, it's just a small number of countries. It's basically the Gulf oil states, the Gulf oil monarchies, and South Africa. That is what this theory is relying on. Smart fraction theory has all of its evidence coming from the Gulf oil monarchies, which have a lot of high-skilled immigrants that come in from other countries and do a lot of the cognitive work, a lot of the engineering work, a lot of the banking work. And then you have the Republic of South Africa. Those are your two exceptions. I think we can come up with theories for why those exceptions exist. Since this research started, it appears that South Africa has become less of an exception over time. It's not a huge change, but it's less of an exception than it used to be. And I think the Gulf monarchies offer a sort of weird piece of evidence for, I guess, anarcho-capitalism, right? Where you should have a monarch in charge. But I don't think it's a coincidence that those are oil monarchies.
And they're all small too.
Huge, and they're all small too. Yeah.
And so you can actually like use, you don't need large popular support to have a repressive regime succeed, which like in a large country would probably be different.
And they might have a neighbor or two nearby who might be willing to stop any political revolts. I mean, I'm just throwing that out speculatively. I don't particularly know. So.
Let's talk about. Sorry,
just one more question before we get off of the stats stuff into the other. I was also wondering, like, is there some kind of effect because of the fact that income scales exponentially at the top end of the range, where sort of if you have a higher percentage of people above some IQ, you would just expect the aggregate GDP to be higher because, like, if somebody's making 10 times as much versus 10 times less, they're just going to dominate at the averaging level. Or I don't know how the data is adjusted, but just wanted to.
That's a great question. The reason this turns out to not be a problem is economists always take the logs of wages or the logs of GDP. And the real reason we do that is because that's the way the relationships work. If you just look at the raw data, you say, wow, if I take the log of GDP or the log of national income, it really does look like one IQ point has at least some percentage relationship. So the link between IQ and wages is not a dollar relationship, it's a percentage relationship. And, people can squint at the data and say, well, maybe at the very high end, it gets a little bit super exponential or a little bit sub-exponential. But to me, that's small potatoes compared to the big story. The big story is so many relationships in econ are basically multiplicative type relationships, percentage type relationships. We kind of take it for granted. And it's only in times like this where it comes up and you end up having to talk about it.
No, that makes sense. I figured that was probably how the analysis was done, but just wanted to double check since, like, I think people, who are doubting the stats are trying to find various ways of.
Yeah. Now, I will point out to you.
I just wanted to double check that.
This is a case where when I've written my books and I've created graphs in my books, I don't know if this would be true now, but in the past I've had editors tell me, when you're writing a popular book, you can't use logs on the y-axis. You need to you can't use a ratio scale so that. And so I end up using dollar scales, and my data plots always end up looking like this huge exponential. It's obvious exponential relationship, and people think, wow, it matters so much more at the top. And I say in dollars, yes, but not in percentages.
Well, the interesting question is, what percentage of people who enthusiastically read your popular books even are put off by the use of log? I'd be interested to know what.
I just don't know because I live on Twitter and I get more feedback on Twitter. And on Twitter, the people who are engaging with me are folks who know that a log scale is the way to look at it. And I've had people reply to me and say, you should log that graph. So I instantly pull up one where it is logged and screenshot it. So in my academic papers, it's all logged. In the books, it's not logged.
You have to tell the editor, my audience are the type of people who listen to long form podcasts and like log graphs.
That's what I need to say. I need to I'll show up a clip from the two of you and send that to my editor next time.
Cool. So let's get into some of the mechanics of what makes this stuff multiplicative, right? So there's one effect which maybe is more intuitive to people, which is not unrelated to what we just talked about, which is the idea that some people have a lot higher impact on, or that the impact of some people's work is less internalized than others, right? So some people are mostly externalities, especially if you have a large policy question. If you're a high IQ person in a policy, in the policy realm, you can imagine that you have a much larger impact than you probably internalize, for example. And so there's definitely that mechanism going on. And then there is I think what broadly falls under the umbrella of, smarter people cooperate better and find better equilibria. So do you see those two things as separate, or or is what I'm saying kind of subsumed in the cooperation stuff?
No, I think it's useful to think of them as separate, right? Because there are different channels that you could bring up. So for instance, you're totally right that people working in policy positions create massive externalities, massive spillovers. Those can be positive or negative, right? So Lee Kuan Yew, had massive positive externalities in Singapore, as far as we can tell, compared to the next best person who would have the job. Mao had incredible negative externalities on the people of China compared to the next best person who probably would have had the job. Best thing he ever did was die so that some moderate capitalists could take over, right? So those policy positions running the world of government is all about creating externalities. That's part of the reason some people are drawn to public service. I want to do something that helps other people, not just myself. So then the question is, are there other reasons why it's good to have a bunch of smart people in government beyond the fact that smarter people are more likely to, say, pick capitalism and figure out and run it in a fairly efficient way? That takes us to that second point, which is that smarter groups, when seeing life as a repeated game, are more cooperative. So I think that's really important. That life, basically every sport that anyone plays is a zero-sum game, but economic progress comes from finding positive-sum games and creating more of them. And smarter groups are more likely to turn win-lose games into win-win games. We know that experimentally from these studies of the repeated prisoner's dilemma. There have been a couple of hints of it in research before I started looking into this. But since then, other people, myself, people I've worked with, and other researchers have all shown that people who do better on IQ tests are more likely to make win-win choices in a repeated prisoner's dilemma. When people are facing a temptation to betray someone else or to cooperate, the smarter people are more likely to choose that cooperative choice, even though it's a little bit risky.
So part of that mechanism is, kind of apparent in the definition of IQ, which is like it probably includes the ability to notice the game you're in and then play it optimally, right? So if you're in a one-shot, you defect, and if you're in a repeated game, you cooperate. But then you also highlight some other kind of mechanisms, whether you want to think of them separately or not, which is smarter people tend to be more patient and have better sort of risk calculus, right? You talk about the 3 Ps. Do you want to highlight what those are?
Yeah. So Axelrod has an excellent book called The Evolution of Cooperation. I recommend it to any of you.
We both read it and thoroughly enjoyed
it. Thanks. Yeah, the audience would love it too, I think. It's still underrated. My late GMU colleague, Gordon Tullock, plays a small cameo role in there. And so Axelrod tried to sum up some of the rules of cooperation. I pulled out 3 of them that mattered for me. And I call them the 3 Ps of the repeated prisoner's dilemma. And they are that if you want to have people cooperate more often, teams of people cooperate, it's good to have groups of people who are more patient, more perceptive, and more pleasant. And patient just means what you think, like being willing to focus in the long run rather than the short run, giving thought for the morrow. And being more perceptive means understanding the rules of the game, knowing what game you're playing in the first place, and being able to remember what happened in past rounds and keep that in mind. That helps build cooperation. Hey, was this person nice to me for a while, or was this person mean to me last time? And what are the rules of the game in the first place? What are all these numbers sitting on the computer screen? And the third one is more pleasant, and that can show up in a lot of different ways. It's not that, as far as we can tell, smarter people are nicer overall, but they're more likely to play something close to tit for tat, which is if you were nice to me, I'll be nice to you. In our experiment, in some experiments, some people find that in the first round, higher IQ people are more likely to play nice in the first round of the game, kind of starting off with a good foot. In other games, people find more that if someone was nice to them in the first round, they're more likely to reciprocate. They're more likely to play tit for tat. So pleasantness, I think, will show up in different ways in different games. I don't think there's any iron rule that smarter people are nicer. It doesn't show up in psychological research. But I think when there's a cynical motive to be nicer, smarter people are more likely to figure out that cynical motive.
Is there part of being perceptive that is... is there part of being perceptive that's also just like... that high IQ people are better at detecting other high IQ people and people who are likely to play nice? Because like you obviously get a much bigger payoff if you have correctly kind of identified the whether that's through culture or just like gauging your opponents in a game. You would think that a smart person who's born in a dysfunctional society would still defect, right? So because he's like correctly predicted that he's amongst defectors.
Defectors, yeah.
And like, yeah, I guess I have this is an experiment that I would love to like see someone run is just kind of if you put someone high IQ, are they much better at telling who else is high IQ in the room by having some structured conversations? And like my intuition says yes, but yeah.
I'm very open to that. I'm open to that, but I also think that they just in general are more socially perceptive, which comes up from the fact that intelligence predicts social intelligence. Intelligence predicts emotional intelligence on average. And so they're better at reading the room on average. And, if a person's playing the game in a very cynical way, playing a cooperation game, whether it's a political game up here on Capitol Hill, which is to my right, or whether they're sitting in some lab experiment, their job is to figure out who can I do business with, right? Who's going to help me get something that's good for me? And if you're looking at a repeated prisoner's dilemma, you know that there are two ways to get something out of the other person. One is to rip them off forever, which probably isn't going to work, because eventually it'll just turn into a war of all against all. And the other option is, can we find a way to play win-win, at least for a few rounds, before I try to betray you and stab you in the back at the last moments?
But then by induction, you'd always defect, right? Like if there's any finiteness to the prisoner's dilemma, then you would kind of work backward. They always defect.
You're totally right about this, right? This is one of these great questions of game theory: is why do people still cooperate in finitely repeated prisoners' dilemmas? And it turns out in our experiment that we ran it as that I ran with Omar Al-Ubaidli and Yap Wheel. We actually ran it as a 10-round finite prisoner's dilemma. If I'd been smarter, I would have pushed my colleagues to do an infinitely repeated, something where it has a 50% chance of ending the round. But we did it 10 rounds, and still we found this result that smarter pairs of people were more cooperative than less smart pairs. There is a theoretical argument for this that comes from some economic theorists. It had been long-standing. And the theory is it's a version of fake it till you make it. It's a version of saying, there's some chance that the other person playing the game is not fully super hyper rational, using backward induction to realize, there's only 10 rounds, so we better just start off defecting. Maybe there's a chance the other person is just like a person who plays tit for tat like a robot. And if there's even a small chance that person is playing tit for tat like a robot, that means that person thinks there's a small chance that I'm just a robot who plays tit for tat. And so maybe we can just play tit for tat until the last round and then betray each other. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a galaxy brain story, except that it captures it's basically a way of shoehorning in something that we all think, which is like, we know every game's going to end, but come on, can't we just make this cooperation work for a while? Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, married couples know that like they're going to die one of them's going to die at some point, and they don't start out the relationship with betrayal instantly, right? So even couples that are having like a summer romance, sort of like at the beginning of Greece, right? They say like, we know this is going to end, but let's just be nice to each other through the summer. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens in our experiment. We found that the higher IQ pairs of players were more likely to cooperate along for the early rounds, and then it would fall apart toward the end. They did a version of fake it till you make it. And that's something that I think is a powerful idea. It had been powerful in theory for a long time. And we found that smarter people were more likely to stumble across that very weird hypothetical economic idea.
I mean, I do wonder how much of that has to do with what they're coming in from the outside, right? Like smarter people in the lab are, smarter people out in the real world interacting in probably on average more cooperative situations as well. So like, I wonder if there's just like a background reinforced thing where, yes, you might play tit for tat overall, but maybe you start shifting to slightly nicer than tit for tat or slightly less nice than tit for tat, depending on how others are acting around you. So that like, even if there's two smart people in a very high defector society, even when they come into contact with one another, they're still likely to defect with each other, even though they would both be tit for tat people had they had a different context or something like that. Yeah,
it'd be nice if they could have gotten to know each other a little better before the game started, right? And so that's part of the reason we do like meet and greets and icebreakers. So this to circle back towards something that Vaishnav mentioned earlier. So Aldo Rusticchini and his co-authors ran some experiments that were better set up than ours. And they actually ran it as an so-called infinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma, where the game had a 50% chance of winning each round. And there they found that there was a huge difference, a much bigger difference than we found, between the high IQ pairs of players and the low IQ pairs of players and their rates of cooperation. Huge disjoint. They followed that up with a second paper and both of these got published in absolute top journals, much better than we got published in. And I think well-deserved, because they were just better organize his papers. Better organize his experiments. They got at deeper questions. And the second one, actually, what they did is they put some smarties with some not so smarties together and compared them to the sort of two control groups. The high highs were one experimental group or one control group. The low lows were another control group. And then this new experimental group was what happens when you put a high with a low together. And the answer was, in their experiment, the way they set it up, that the low learned to start cooperating after a while. Basically, the high person used enough tit for tat to sort of discipline the other person. Part of what I think is going on is that less intelligent people often come to new problems by just sort of pressing random buttons on the dashboard of life to see what happens. And they're sort of paying attention to the environment because they do want to learn. And if there's someone there who knows how things are working, that person tries to find a way to teach the other person. And in this case, what happens is that the smarter person teaches the less sharp person to cooperate and makes the less smart person richer as a result. So to me, this is a very utopian story, almost Pollyanna-ish. It could depend on the precise way the game was set up, but it did work, and it worked really repeatedly and robustly. Like, I was really impressed by this second result, that the smarties can teach the not-so-smarties how to be a little bit nicer. A lot nicer, actually.
Sidebar, but...
Do you know if...
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, just one specific question on that. Do you know, related to that, did the high, like the average between the high highs and the low lows, was that still better than the average of the high lows? As in, were the gains from higher cooperation between two individuals versus the defection among the lower IQ individuals bigger than the amount that they were able to bring somebody up, the high versus the low? I don't know if I don't think I explained that properly.
I think they closed well over 80% of the gap. Putting a high and a low together, they're basically ran it as a lot of rounds. I can't remember how many rounds it turned out to be on average. But they closed an enormous amount of the gap. Let's say 80%. I think that would capture it, the spirit of it. So the highs would have been better off if they'd been matched with another high. So it's not like the highs were ripping off the low that they were paired with. So that maybe gets to part of your question. But the low is just so much better off. It really is. It's like if I wanted to tell a sort of a message, if I wanted to give a message for the open borders community, it's like try to set up society so that you match the highs with the lows, so that the lows learn to cooperate more.
But there's a right, but you have to play like a more forgiving version as a smart person playing with a not so smart person, because like presumably they'll start off defecting and you'll start off cooperating, but you can't do tit for tat because then you'll defect forever. So you have to like have some room where you show people how cooperation is done and then punish only if they like refuse to get the message or something like that, right?
Well, let me clarify there that tit for tat is pretty kind of forgiving, right? With tit for tat, that's not as bad as a grim trigger. Tit for tat is, I see you defect once, I defect. But if you go back to cooperating, I'll cooperate. So if the other person is just pressing random buttons on the computer screen, sometimes they'll hit cooperate and sometimes they'll hit defect. And they might notice after a while, hey, when I randomly hit cooperate, this person cooperates with me next time. And so that's all the kind of learning you need. And again, they set up the game in such a way that it was kind of easy to figure out that cooperating together was pretty rewarding. I think real life isn't quite that forgiving. Real life makes it a little bit more tempting to defect. But you know, it's nice to know that at least in this one setting, the defector, the people with less skills can come in and learn to cooperate. There is a more extreme version, as to just let the audience know, what's known as the grim trigger strategy, which is much beloved of economic theorists because it's easy to do the math of it. And in a grim trigger strategy, you let the other person know in the first round, hey, if you ever defect, even once, I'm just going to defect on you forever. You know, this is basically, I'm going to burn the house. I'm going to burn the town down. If you ever, like if you pay 1 penny less than what you owe in taxes, I will burn your house down. That's what's called a grim trigger strategy or a trigger strategy. That makes it, you know, you can't build trust out of that, right? You have to have some kind of forgiveness. That's sort of there's a sort of moral message in there that a little bit of forgiveness is actually in your own self-interest.
But to be fair, the real world, when you translate it to the real world, you have to like adjust things for the payoffs, right? Because like in a computer simulation, each round is the same payoff. But like in reality, if you like fuck me over on something that's actually important, I have to like punish you to appropriately deter the next, right? Like for the expected value of the whole thing. So that's sort of like an interesting way in which this, you can't just map tit for tat as a strategy one-on-one, onto sort of like, more consequential things, right? Like, so what do we do with people that commit crimes or break norms or so have you? But like maybe what it points to is just having gradation when you punish defectors and slicing that into more fine pieces.
That's a point that actually the late Elinor Ostrom really emphasized when groups of people were trying to solve common pool resource problems, public goods creation problems, is that having a gradation of punishments was really important in real life. So if for your listeners who are trying to apply these lessons to real policy settings, her Nobel speech, bullet points that any AI would give you on Elinor Ostrom's insights, really has a lot of information about how to solve these cooperation problems in the real world.
I was thinking about the temptation to defect in the context of living in New York and taking public transit and things like that, where people do have a higher temptation, I would think, because they're not seeing the same people again. And you see people playing music with no headphones on, for a stupid example, right? Like they're just, but then so
how much do people tip it? How much do people tip at the airport Starbucks versus their local neighborhood Starbucks, right? Those same folks doing the same kind of work, and you just know that they get way more tips from the local place.
Exactly. But I think the positive message in my mind is as you experience positive things from cooperation, you're more the amount of people in New York that don't defect is still a massive, massive majority. It's 95% of people are not defecting. 5% is so many in the context of how big the city is that it's still very problematic.
Yes.
But I think actually the defection bar here should be that you're not willing to enforce along with the other non-defectors against the defector or something. That would be the next level of cooperation, that you're willing to do the annoying thing of enforcing the rule, even though you get no positive payoff out of it or something like that. But anyway, point is that I think that when you're living in a society where most people are not defecting, even when you're pretty sure it's not going to be a repeated game, you tend to be very likely to not defect.
And so
that might just be because you pay a little psychological cost in your mind.
Right.
For thinking
so this
yourself as a bad
trains your
person.
mind.
Yeah.
But I'm sure if you grow up somewhere where people are defecting on all these things all the time, like in countries where people litter, they don't have any they don't feel bad about littering, right? Because there's been no reinforcement of that practice as something that we, punish each other for on a societal level or whatever.
Same reason I don't feel bad about not recycling. I'm confessing my deepest sin right here on your podcast.
We actually often talk about...
this is an argument in our house about I recycle just because, even though I don't think it's effective or I don't really believe it's effective, I don't believe that we're doing it well enough to actually get it to work and all of that, but it's too deeply ingrained. And
tell me you're Canadian without being Canadian.
That's a generational thing partly, I think. So yeah. Beg pardon?
No, I was saying it's partly because Reagan is Canadian and I'm Indian, so we have different impulses on some of these things. But I was saying we actually think about your work a lot when we're in the subway, in the New York City subway, because every time, because I think we're both on the side of the spectrum where we have very high sensitivity to people that impose small externalities, but on large numbers of people, noise, background noise, or speaking without headphones on. And Reagan gets annoyed by people selling stuff on the sidewalk, and we always put it in this context because we're they're just getting away by diffusing the externalities across a large number of people.
Yes. And so this is something where, a utilitarian would look at it and say, well, it's obvious if I look at the utilities that the costs imposed on these many people are bigger than the benefits to this one person. But, an economist would come in who's not a utilitarian and say, why can't we just rearrange the institution so that we change, so that the many buy off the person who wants to create the noise, right? Why can't Why can't we just set up a local payment app so that we all pay off the person to turn off their music that's playing really loudly? Can't we all set up automated micropayments on our smartphone that will kick in once someone turns on their music? So I don't know. Like,
that's the future of AI.
Yeah, we could contractually resolve a lot of this is the sort of Kosian story, right? If you're willing to assume low enough transaction costs, you should be able to negotiate away all these even threats to create massive negative externalities. Of course, what that means is that the person who's threatens to create massive negative externalities ends up being able to extract rents from all the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to promise. You have to just walk out on your rooftop at 2 a.m. and start threatening to sing Ave Maria to all of your neighbors at the top of your voice.
That's what we'll do if we get strapped on cash and demand a bounty
exactly.
in return for us.
Just wait till the app gets set up and it'll be automated micropayments from. I mean, if you're in New York City, that could be thousands of people who would each kick in $1 to get you to stop.
Yeah. So one way in which like all of this connects to some of the macro stuff, right? And before we get into kind of the political story there and the story of political institutions, another pushback that I've seen in some of these reviews of your work is the idea that, and I think this is more broad than just your book, where it's like, okay, we know what people do in repeated games. We know sort of like these, we know cooperation generally matters, but we have no way of linking these micro foundations to like macro effects, right? And I want to get your response on that, but like I think one instinctive response I had was that with some of these things, it really is an epistemological preference on like how much weight you give to things that we all intuitively, you know, if you work in a company or just live life, you kind of know externalities matter, and like you know that cooperation is like enmeshed in everyday life, but yeah, how do you deal with that? You know, because I'm guessing you agree that it's the link is not as strong as you'd like, but it truly is because it's a ubiquitous, like all pervasive thing that's like hard to measure and like clean out the effects of.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say part of it is that I start off with one micro-founded channel, one causal channel that really is obviously has to be important, and that's the patience channel. Because smarter people are more patient on average, and that's shown up both in experimental and more real-world settings. And people who are more patient are more likely to save, which gets you more physical capital. So, and that's obvious. So I start off with something really concrete that's just hard to deny. And so that link between IQ, smarter people are more patient people save more. If your country saves more, you're going to have a bigger capital stock, which makes you more productive. That's something you just can't get away from. But then from that, I build this fuzzier story, right? Which is that, hey, patience, according to a whole lot of game theory, is really important to opening the door to win-win outcomes in games. And half of institutional economics, which is something George Mason is a world famous for, half of institutional economics is about setting up these games where if people are foresighted and patient, they have more of an interest in growing the pie. So I think that should be something it's something that has to linger in the back of your mind through every single discussion of institutions, whether those institutions are government institutions or large corporations. Because large corporations have a lot of the same planning problems, long-term reputation problems that governments do. This is, I think, one of the great GMU insights that you can learn. You can learn a lot about government by looking at big business, and you can learn a lot about big business by looking at government. Two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways. So there it's a sort of intuitive story. But when we think about the incentive of government leaders to grow the pie and to focus on the long run, there patience just has to matter a lot. And if you have a population of folks who are smarter, you're more likely to wind up with a politician who's smarter, because politicians are going to be some kind of draw from the distribution.
Does this show up in the macro data? So do countries, adjusting for per capita GDP, do countries with higher median IQs have higher savings rates or something like that?
It's been too long since I've run that particular regression for me to say.
Because East Asian countries will fall in that camp, but I don't know if it like holds up.
Yeah. So it's been too long since I've run that regression, but I do know that in the data, in the paper, in the work that paper that I worked on for a long time and then just decided to put in the book, essentially. Under a wide variety of tests, countries with higher IQ scores did have higher savings rates. I can't remember whether that survived a control for GDP per capita. I'm not sure you should be controlling for GDP per capita in that case, but because it's multiple causation. But I will say that it is clear that higher IQ countries do have higher savings rates, and that multiple tests have shown that even controlling for GDP per capita, countries with higher average IQ tend to have higher institutional quality. Now, I think part of the reason that's showing up is because the oil countries have high GDP per capita, but they don't really need the institutional quality, right? So in a way, that's actually should be a good test of this because higher oil riches don't seem to make their populations substantially smarter.
But it does make them richer, right?
It does make them richer. So that helps get at this reverse causation story where people say, hey, maybe it's just that when you get rich, you get higher IQs. Well, we got a whole bunch of oil countries. And you could even look, I did this in an early paper, my early paper with Schneider. If you look at the oil countries pre and post the big oil shock of the 70s and check to see, like, did the IQs go up a lot? It's a very informal test, but I didn't find any evidence of that. So it's just, again, I think by now, I ran that in 2005 or so. I think by now somebody could do a more sophisticated version of that with math and science and reading tests around the world.
Right. I had one question that relates to some of the cooperation research that you're talking about, where the highs were able to bring up the lows a little bit. Yeah, so,
a lot.
The sort of, right, a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking of like the implications of the thesis and the cooperation part in particular, because on the one hand, you want to have Silicon Valley or whatever in the country where a bunch of smart people can get together and form a mini hive mind around something and make each other more productive and all of that. But then you also want the smart people to design systems and interact with everybody else in ways that basically leverage their productivity beyond what they would have been able to do on their own, right? Which is sort of the highs bringing up the lows. So just living in a high trust capitalist system, even if you're relatively low skilled, you're still able to contribute more than you would be otherwise, right? So anyway, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, like, from a global perspective, if we weren't being nationalistic, what do you see as the implications on the macro level in terms of how you want to, like, pair people, how people could be, made more productive or whatever. And then also on the micro side, like, if you were a manager, would you do sort of the putting my best two minds on the project and letting them go off and do their own thing? Or would you be like, you're going to mentor Sally because she's struggling to understand, anyway, I'm just trying to think of, like, the big side and the small side of those potentially competing effects.
Well, if I'm thinking about global long-term well-being, then I really have to think about the fact that essentially all long-run economic progress comes from innovation, from R&D, from science, from engineering. And there, I really want to have teams of people who are able to just create the best stuff at the largest scale. And so this is part of why I say that the 7 countries I refer to as the I-7, the 7 most innovative countries. We should be interested not just in protecting their institutional quality, but in improving it as much as possible so that they can innovate more and create more, cool tech, more awesome cultural innovations, more medical research that helps people all over the world. So we roughly know where the next wave of biomedical, technological, scientific innovations are going to be coming from. And it's going to be countries in the top, overwhelmingly countries in the top 10% of the global income distribution, with the one exception of China, right? Which makes it up on volume. And making sure that those innovation powerhouses can do the most possible and are not basically held back, that's, I think, going to be crucial. So I think there's a strong moral argument for treating the world's most innovative countries as special cases that should be protected and improved for the sake of the entire planet, if we care about the long run. The second part of this is that this is a version of Michael Kremer's story. Like, do I want to match? How much do I want the highs to pair with the lows and try to bring them up? That's very much it's going to end up being on some level a very case by case story, because you would like to find less expensive workers and try to be able to make something great out of them, right? That can help your country, that can help your company be more profitable, and it could have some global spillover effects potentially. That said, when we want, when you decide it's time to build a nuclear weapon in rural New Mexico, you want the best people on the job, with no exceptions, right? Mm-hmm. You just really want the best team, because to use Michael Kremer's O-ring story, if one small piece of the space shuttle breaks, in his case a rubber O-ring, the whole system can blow up. So when a system has many small moving parts, even one small failure can dramatically reduce the value of the project. You really want to make sure you have your best minds available. I think this is why finding some ways to move toward in the general direction of at-will employment in STEM-heavy, innovation-heavy fields is going to be an important step for increasing productivity in the future if we can make those kind of reforms.
And I guess it does matter if how much interdependency there is in the process you're talking about. So if you imagine like a sales team, right, that's just kind of selling software or selling anything, then that process is like less multiplicative. It's more additive in the sense that like if someone fails, that's fine. In fact, you want people, you want to kind of, it's sort of a VC model in a way where it's like, okay, it's cool if I have like one star player that can make up for everything else. And what I found like thinking about organizational structure is that actually you kind of need a matrix of both at different levels. So is at the top most level, it's multiplicative. And then within departments, you have to like build redundancy to make it kind of, to give people slack. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And in particular, you want to set up the organization so that one weirdo really can't screw up the whole system, right? So this, I have this paper on this where I build on Kremer's theory in a moderate way. And I say there's some kind of jobs that are these O-ring jobs, and there are other jobs that are foolproof jobs. And in the foolproof jobs, you can just throw a bunch of fools at it, right? And they'll get it done eventually if you throw enough warm bodies at it. A lot of jobs are not like that, right? Building a nuclear weapon, getting, flying rockets to Mars, you just need the best people, right? But part of economic success for a large firm is finding ways to turn these O-ring, very fragile jobs, multiplicative jobs, as you call them, into foolproof style jobs where if someone screws up, it doesn't hurt things. And you can think like something every corporate brand has to worry about is, will one of our minor employees say something terrible on social media that hurts our corporate reputation, right? So this is the kind of thing that people wonder about, right? And so foolproofing your organization so that one fool can't ruin the value of the brand is actually important, right? You need to make sure you have to be very careful about which employees have access to your company's Twitter account.
Yeah.
I think that, one thing that I'm taking away from these examples is like the more scalable the thing you're working on, the more people that it's going to ultimately affect, the more you want to go with the multiplicative, all the best people only, because whatever the product that they make is going to be useful to many other people in some small way. Yeah. Whereas like the sales example or whatever, it's like if you're just working on a single project, that's where the mentorship model is more probably effective. So like a very low performing salesperson will probably become much better after a year being paired with a high performing salesperson, and they won't hurt the high performing salesperson at all. Whereas, if you're working on some kind of scalable payment system that's going to decrease transaction costs globally, then, it'll help everybody already. You don't need to like bring anyone up to that. You just need to create the structure, create the process, and then let them be bounded by it.
Yeah, this overlaps a bit. The two categories that we're going back to overlap a bit with basically increasing returns, natural monopolies, creative destruction on the one hand, and diminishing return stories, which is where most of price theory lives, right? Mm-hmm. Do I think that the supply curve in this industry slopes up? Well, that's diminishing returns. Do I think the supply curve in this industry slopes down? Well, that's probably increasing returns. So, and a lot of these increasing returns fields, that's where innovation comes from. That's where scientific progress comes from. That's the economic frontier. And that's where we'd like to make sure that we can put the best workers together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some people get tripped up because it's like, without getting into the physics of things, there's no like obvious reason why a world had to be this way, but it turns out that this is how things work, right? And like I think it's sort of like counterintuitive to people, but all you have to look at is just the empirical data on just sort of like what has lifted living standards in the developing world the most, and then you have the answer. So
to pick on that physics thing, I learned recently that in the discovery of electricity, one of the things that made it tough for people to believe in positive versus negative charges was that they had this intuition from gravity that like things work one way, things pull, right? Things that are close together pull. There's no such thing as negative gravity where things push apart. So now you're telling us with electricity and magnets that there's sometimes they push together and sometimes they pull apart. This is unintuitive. So coming up with the idea of positive and negative charges was a tough sell. Ben Franklin was part of this. I'm reading Craig Roach's book on this, Simply Electrifying, partly about the history of electricity. But there was a big intellectual battle because the paradigm of Newton was being overturned here, right? In a way, the paradigm of that it applied well to chemistry as well, right? Where pressure worked kind of the same way as gravity did, in a way where everything went in one direction. With electricity, now we're like plus is one thing and plus minus is something else.
So what's the economic equivalent? It's like kind of the demise.
I think it's increasing. Yeah. I think it's increasing versus diminishing returns because, and again, if I wanted to point to a book on this, I can't remember if I mentioned this one to you. It's Knowledge and the Wealth of Nations. It's a book by former Boston University, Boston Globe economics columnist, and it really tells the story of Paul Romer and his mathematization of the economics of innovation. And part of what he does is Romer is coming back to the traditional Adam Smith story, which is Adam Smith told us two things. Competition is great. That's the diminishing return story. And on the other hand, certain teams of people, if they're organized well, can create massive increasing returns where we don't get any of the rules of perfect competition. So the tension between the world of innovation and the world of perfect competition is a tough contrast for economists. I think GMU, again, does a good job handling this tension in a way that a lot of other folks are still catching up to.
Yeah, I was listening to Romer on, I think Econ Talk, and I didn't know he was a physicist, and he was talking about how like one of the fundamental things he learned was, or the analogies that he drew was just like in physics, you don't actually produce new things, right? Like matter doesn't go away. Like it's energy is conserved. That kind of, if you bring that paradigm to economics, you know that like economic growth isn't about producing stuff as people kind of into it. It's about rearranging things so they're more valuable.
About reorganizing. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's one of his great ideas of that economic growth comes from new recipes, not from creating new matter. Yeah. Reorganizing the same materials we already have.
So the next thing I wanted to touch on was how this whole story of cooperation then shapes political institutions, right? Because if you think at the national level, and when we're talking about sort of where you're born kind of dictates outcomes even more than your individual IQ, then we have to talk about like the mechanisms through which that happens. And we've talked a little bit about industry, but there's also, what institutions do you design at the political level to serve the populace and to like kind of negotiate these questions and find good ways to cooperate and cooperate in positive some ways. Now, I wonder if it's like, I've been thinking about this in two separate categories. So one is just the design choice question of institutions, right? So like when you set up a country, you make all these sort of decisions about, are we going to have a PR system versus first past the post? Are we going to stagger elections? All these things that have implications for, or at least can go some way towards kind of, nudging people towards better equilibria is kind of how I'm thinking about it. Mm-hmm. But then, and so if you look at a country like India for its like level of wealth when it was set up, maybe because of mostly because it was copied to a large extent from the British Constitution and institutions, but also because the elite that kind of founded the country were sort of infused with those ideals. I think the institutional design was good, but then what you see is the second part, which is how do people behave within those because the people are part of the institutions too, and no one system is sort of foolproof. And so the way I'm conceptualizing this is, given that no one sort of institutional design system is foolproof, you need the layers that are not visible, which is like people naturally cooperating and sort of like understanding the spirit of the system and not sort of trying to backstab and find the first loophole. And that's sort of the second part. And that's where maybe national IQ matters more, because what you see in a country like India is the design and the democratic process was set up properly, but then, it just gets co-opted by the people that are sort of in power. Does that, like, would you take issue with that framing? How do you think about that?
I mean, I'm willing to take the general framing as long as I add on that the people who are in power are in India, which is really a democracy, true democracy, right? By normal real world standards. I mean, they're going back and just trying to please the voters, which includes some particularly influential elites back in their home district, right? So, India, for better or worse, is a source of endless academic studies for economists. Right. Partly that's because English is widely used as a language there. So, academics can get access to it. And also we have a lot of great grad students who've come from India, so they understand the cultural norms, the rules, can easily travel. So one of my favorite little studies is that in India, banks definitely appear to make loans to whatever party is in power.
Yep.
So banks know that it's really in your interest to lend generously to people who are strongly associated with the political party in power. New party comes to power, you know which side to start lending to. So the politicization of bank lending is one of these nice little applications where, it's a simple form of corruption, right, in a way. But it's one that's probably going to be pretty popular, even among the voters, because the voters will say, like, I want you to help my party because then that party's going to help me. So, of course, I support Congress Party, I support BJP, whichever side I'm on. I'm going to want I want my team to get more stuff. So if you think politics is a zero-sum game, banking is part of banking is part of that zero-sum game, and I want the resources to be distributed to me.
Yeah, and
and to my team.
Right, and it ties in very nicely with like how much ethnic politics or caste-based politics had to do with, India's so kind of ethnically diverse that, and when you have people campaigning on those it just, the incentive to cooperate is also lower because the messaging from the politicians is one of, you're in a zero-sum contest for these resources with like 5 other ethnic groups, right?
Yeah.
And it's only recently that I think it's funny, like the Hindu majoritarian politics by Modi. One interesting feature of it is it clearly is polarizing, but because it polarizes 70% of the country against the 30, people can still campaign on broad-based economic reform that kind of affects everyone or uplifts everyone. And it's a weird way in which majoritarianism might have it might be better than the zero-sum contest where it's like 10 factions fighting each other or something like that.
Yeah, so the most inclusive bigotry can actually end up ironically favoring pie-growing policy choice.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me using that phrasing.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an inclusive form of bigotry, right? A version of this, happened in the United States, right? One could have imagined American white politics in the South being driven by these like breakdowns between English and Germans and Scotch-Irish and whatnot. And all the Southern white bigots just agreed we're going to treat people of African descent as the outgroup, and therefore we'll all call a truce amongst each other, with the exception of Catholics, I guess, and Jews, right? And so this is people searching for these weird definitions and their ways to build political coalitions. Sometimes they build coalitions in ways that our culture currently approves of, and sometimes they build these coalitions in ways they don't approve of. One of my little favorite facts I learned just recently is that in countries with more ethnic diversity that have parliamentary systems, the cabinets tend to be bigger. Greater the ethnic diversity, the bigger the cabinet. Why? Because you need to slice the salami thinner among all the elite groups, right? We have so many rents that we're going to distribute, and everybody wants a seat at the table. So we've got 3 big ethnic groups. We slice up the rents among the 3 of us. If we've got 15 major ethnic groups now it's like 15 different groups we got to negotiate. And those negotiations are obviously going to be difficult, costly, clunky, can lead to backfiring and civil conflict because there's just so many little bargains to strike. Right? Politics is all about striking bargains, but adding on the ethnic one is just an extra additional one. So,
yeah, I mean, Reagan and I were talking about this right before, which is it's more of an open question. I want to see if you have instincts on this. Do you think a larger country, all else equal, India would be a good example, has advantages if it means even, especially if they have low-ish average IQs, because then you can like still find people at the right tails to kind of run your institutions and kind of, especially if you believe in these multiplicative processes, then it has to be better to be a large poor country than a small one.
And relating to the research you were talking about earlier, instead of talking about like, oh, what are the top 5% of people, it would be what are the top million people's average IQ exactly. Or whatever, right?
Yeah. Now, if it were true, it would have shown up in the data by now, I have to say. The real rule, which I actually start a lot of my classes with, is pointing out that highly populous countries on average aren't richer or poorer than other countries. So, and really no matter how you slice the data, that's kind of how it looks. China and India are both about in the global middle right now, right? China higher now. So if the story you were saying were absolutely first order, we'd see a big benefit to these more populous countries. So my guess is there's some kind of Laffer curve trade-off story going on here, where the bigger the country, the more groups there are to bargain with.
Yeah.
Or the bigger, at least, maybe even something as simple as the greater the number of forms of geographies and hence types of local economies you're having to bargain with.
And right? Like more principal agents.
As part of the coalition.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, think of the U.S., right? And Canada alike, right? These huge spaces, whether you have a lot of people or a few people, there are just basically multiple types of economies you're going to be having to negotiate with in your national Congress. You got the Great Plains, you got the weird West out there, which might not even be accessible if you don't have railroads. You got this very swampy South, which tries to find some kind of agriculture that works there, sometimes doesn't. You got the Northeast industrial parts, like very different economies and the bigger the spaces, the more likely you are going to cover different economic geographies, which means more difficult negotiation. So basically, greater scale means on some level greater cost of negotiation, which might counteract this benefit of the right tail story, which, I mean, I absolutely believe it has to be true, but it's not big enough to show up in the data. So it's probably bouncing back against something like the channel I'm mentioning.
One thing I was thinking about sort of the institutional design and process and things like that was when you were talking about, if you can foolproof a job, like that's one part of the work at a large corporate entity or whatever, is there's people like, you could think of the PR team or HR or all these different things are in part trying to foolproof the business. And, within the larger context, like of a country, foolproofing is often taking things that would be prisoners' dilemmas and making them no longer prisoners' dilemmas, right?
Absolutely,
or at least making the payoff such that from the Axelrod book that it can evolve. So, a lot of the times when we're talking about like corruption and stuff, the reality is it's just that corruption pays, and if corruption paid here, people would be doing it more too, and it doesn't.
Absolutely.
And
it pays a lot less than it used to, at least, right? I mean, it just used to be a lot more open, right? Yeah.
Right. But so since it pays less than it used to, it's like there is a possibility for institutions to evolve. And so, yeah, I wonder, I guess like partly the having good people, smart people in those positions somehow creates a process where you're able to redesign them so that the problem doesn't even arise. And the incentive is never there to be tempted by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I'm just trying to figure out like, how does that evolve? Because I know, in the US, I was just reading something where it was talking about how, Congress people did not used to compromise on things, and it was much more, backstabbing and stuff. And then they somehow, it's one of these things, I guess, which Axelrod talks about, where if you get a small cluster of cooperative people, they can spread that because they outperform at such a high level. So there's got to be some mechanism. And I'm just trying to think about in a big country like India, where there's a lot of smart people, even if the educational level and average is not as high. How do you group them together such that they can create this sort of evolutionary cooperation thing that disseminates? Or I'd be interested in people looking into that, but I don't know if there's any work on that.
I like the idea of creating a couple of, say, institutional centers of excellence that then become models for others because they see how successful it works, right? I mean, obviously this happens all the time within the United States, across the United States, where states learn from other states how to manage Department of Motor Vehicles or how to manage garbage collection. And in some cases, this happens on a very mundane level. Got to be at an event recently where I talked to some financial regulators, one financial regulator who works for one state who works with people from other states. And he says, we really just share a lot of ideas with each other. It's really great that unlike a lot of politics in America, it's not very politicized. We just share ideas. Sometimes we share staff. And I thought that was a really great lesson to hear. If one could find a way to say, like, we're going to invest in some well-targeted centers of excellence and just put the best people here, and then part of what we'll do is pick something that we think other states, say within India, of the many states in India, pick a couple of states and invest in putting the best personnel there, right? And then have that be a model that others will naturally follow, because people kind of like to see success. Like you said, it's hard to resist the siren call of higher economic growth. I mean, that's a whole lot of the story of convergence theory and macroeconomics. People look at what the best countries are doing and they're like, well, I can at least imitate. I can imitate 20% of that, and then maybe I can imitate 40% of that, and then maybe I can imitate 90%.
Yeah, actually, Karthik, who is an economist at your alma mater, I guess, right? UC San Diego, is that where you went?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, we met him, and we're reading his book now, and he has some ideas for this, because it's like there's such low hanging fruit in the way the bureaucracy is designed in India, even though a lot of smart people are in the bureaucracy. Like, for example, most of the senior officers are just given a department for 2 years, and it's like there's no incentive for them to shake things up because they won't reap the rewards, right? So there's simple stuff like that, and then there's also just a bunch of data quality issues. I mean, it really is like reading his book was just like, okay, it seems like there's a lot of low hanging fruit to pick here.
Yeah, Karthik he came after I left, but I've been watching his work with great interest. So it's great to see that UCSD has continue to build its reputation in development econ. It was always a sort of smaller area, but some real excellence there, starting with Jim Rauch, who was there when I was there.
So shifting gears a little bit, we want to ask you a few questions that are just applications of your work. So I'll kick things off, and Reg, feel free to jump in if you have others. Reading sort of Gary Miller's Managerial Dilemmas and just the work you've done, what are some, I guess, low-hanging fruit management practices that you think are still massively underutilized, or if there are any?
Yeah, I'm supposed to be an economist who thinks that everything's efficient, right? So how Chicago-ish am I on this question? Everyone knows about piece rates, right? He talked a little bit about piece rates in there. But the real problem is that so many team efforts in firms have this strong multiplicative element, which he talks about, where the whole is really greater than the sum of the parts. And there's literally no way to give people the right incentives. It would be great if we could find ways to have more targeted versions of something like equity incentives or bonuses for completions of concrete tasks within firms. So basically small team bonuses, substantial small team bonuses for finishing key tangible milestones. And I think that would get you the correct incentives for a lot of medium term, 3-month, 6-month, 12-month goals in corporations.
This is kind of like what Reagan said earlier, where you were talking about it in the subway context, Reg, where people will play the role of I don't know what he calls it, secondary norm enforcer or something. Basically people that not just cooperate, but will shame other people for not cooperating, right? And when you have that, then you solve like some of the principal agent problem. Yeah.
Yeah, basically like kind of getting a lot more of the benefits of smaller firms into bigger firms. I'm a huge fan of Robin Hanson's work on prediction markets, right? And what Robin laments is that many firms try out internal prediction markets. Like, what's the probability that this new software feature on our app will be functional in 6 months? And corporations, they use these things, they find that they work pretty well, and then they cancel them. And Robin's story is in part that people who run the institution don't want there to be an alternative source of status inside the org. They want the market to be the stat. They want their own power to be the status, not a market signal to be the status. And
interesting. I was going to say my intuition is more that 99% of the people know that there's more downside than upside of putting your name on anything or putting a prediction on anything. Like, that's much more my experience is people just don't want to make a decision. They want to leave it ambiguous so that when the unpredictable future happens, they have some way to slot it into them having been right.
Yeah, that's true.
And there's just massive...
that's a middle level explanation, right? So Robin's story is the people at the top don't want it. Yours is that the people doing the work don't want it.
Yeah. Well, no, and I mean, I used to do, like performance measurement of some of the, like, I was in asset management, and, people don't want to be performance measured, or they don't want to be compared to bench. Your team is never the popular one when you're like measuring your colleagues' alpha, right? That's not, nobody wants you to do that. I mean, sure, it might benefit them in sometimes, but they know that like the median long-term benefit is better served by them being able to make narratives for why they did what they did and not to have everything too precise where they can be compared easily to others. Anyway.
I think there's some possibility that AIs will end up feeling like a neutral arbiter to a lot of people on these kinds of questions, and that using those as a way to resolve some of these like internal judgment decisions that might end up feeling like the neutral judge, the deciding judge on a decision. One of my favorite Robin Hanson ideas for management is his Fire the CEO story, which I first learned about when I got to Mason. Are you familiar with this one?
No, is this where
you say, will the stock price go up if we fire the CEO?
Yeah, exactly. And so that basic idea of getting some kind of market-based signal on whether a replacement in the team would have a lot of value is, I think, really, really really important. So I saw him give a talk where he said, if anybody out there has $1 million to invest in this project, I'd be glad to supervise it. I'd be glad to see it happen, because he really does think that it would be so successful in its first few waves that it'd be hard to deny its power. And it could be his traditional story, which is here's the share price if we keep the CEO, and here's the share price condition on getting a new CEO in the next 6 months. And if the price of the new CEO stock goes up by more than a couple percent, then you fire the CEO, right? That's the basic story. You could set it up in a simpler, more transparent way, like an option. But the basic idea that we need more information on which of our large, clunky Fortune 500 orgs are working, like how well are they working and can they be improved? That's really important, because that's where a whole lot of the innovation comes from. I mean, this is part of where, a lot of the business cycle, the intersection between Schumpeterian creative destruction and a lot of real business cycle stuff hits at this, which is like there's a few small chunks of the economy that are making the big innovations, and then everyone else is tinkering with, adding on, morphing them. That means that getting things right in the most important 100 or so big private sector orgs would have big payoffs for the whole planet.
Right. Yeah, no, that goes back to the scalability thing. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I wonder if the signal is stronger, because like in some ways you already get, like, I guess you get an aggregate price signal from like activist hedge funds or short sellers and stuff, right? On kind of management choices, but you don't get like the granularity of like what is the causal like factor that we should most hone in on. One problem with this that I sort of stumbled upon while reading something a couple of weeks ago is there seems to be some concern around just like, is liquidity the central problem that like makes having prediction markets for a bunch of these things pretty hard? Because in financial markets, arbitrageurs can operate because there's also a kind of inelastic demand, right? Like from institutional investors or pension funds or whatever. But in prediction markets, you just have to have enough sort of like, quality signal-based investors, and you need to be able to support like many more numerous questions. I don't know if you, do you think this is like an obstacle in operationalizing prediction markets at scale?
Well, the second part of your question about whether there are just too many questions to answer might just mean that we should just stick to more concrete questions, right? I mean, we know prediction markets do pretty well with the simple question of who's going to win the presidency, right? Because it's very clear. If you peek in the contract, you double check to make sure it's about who gets sworn in and not percentage of the popular vote. The details are very simple and transparent. But you're right that there seems to be some kind of liquidity issue and transaction cost driven issues with even prediction markets for political outcomes, right? Because otherwise, my hunch is it's hard to explain why the shares don't add up to exactly one, right? Yeah. So the transaction costs are big enough that hope and faith and some scams can push up the probability of RFK Jr. winning up to a few percent, right?
Oh, really? Is that what it's at?
I saw that.
It's been a while since I checked, but there was a time when it was like ridiculously high, and it's like
interesting.
And some of that has to do with the carry, with basically the loss of yield in a 5% interest rate environment. Apparently, that drives some of this. Between transaction costs, foregone yield, like you said, then liquidity, these all add up to sort of noise in our estimators. But shorter term prediction market should be able to answer some of our questions for us. But this better information and better incentives together can help us get more good things done. I do think that paving the way to giving AIs substantial legal roles within large organizations will be an improvement too. So, members of boards on corporations, decision makers on panels, having AIs have like at first advisory importance and then eventually like binding importance on big decisions that has the opportunity to be a big productivity boost even before we get to AIs being able to manage scientific labs, which I'm hopeful about.
I know we're coming up on time. I have one question, Regan. Do you have something else you want to ask?
No, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, this is sort of in my day job, we do research on sort of like high impact careers, but it's from a EA perspective, which is not just small EA, but also capital EA, which means there are some philosophical assumptions baked in. But like, what do you think these capital EA movement is getting wrong on like are there any like especially career paths which you would recommend that effective altruists are just missing, right? Like something to do with institutions or your line of work or maybe something completely different?
Well, to talk my own book, I do think that the idea of having a high-skilled immigration policy for the world's most innovative nations is something that the EA people, the long-termists, should take very seriously. I know that a lot of them are sympathetic to open borders type stories, and I think that requires believing falsely that large-scale, low-skilled immigration will not hurt long-run institutional quality. So I think they should be thinking about how to improve institutions in the I-7, how to get more scientific innovation in the I-7, how to bring in better voters who are smarter than the people who are currently there in the I-7. When I came to George Mason, they said, our goal is to hire people who will raise the median productivity in the department and raise the status of the department. So not let's keep it from falling, let's make it better. And I think that's a good goal for the I-7 nations as a whole, because they have a especially rare gift the ability to create ideas that can change the world.
Yeah, I think some open philanthropy is probably funding some immigration related work, but I think there's a general assumption, right? Because that anything that involves changing equilibria doesn't make it on the list because EAs are thinking on the margin, and so there's some opportunities where if it's not immediately operationalizable at the margin for an individual, then they don't end up recommending it. But that's probably changing. But yeah, that was
yeah. But it's interesting though because they think so long term with some of the X risk stuff that you think that would flow through to thinking about institutions and progress and stuff. But
I think part of
no. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say that part of the problem there is that EAs think about the long term, but they think about it they don't think about it from the risk. Like if a corporate was risk managing, they would think about the risk factors, and that's where maybe some of the institution stuff comes in, like broad things you can do that affect everything. Whereas EAs are very focused on the forecasting element. So it's what precise risk can I pinpoint, and then go all in on that, right? And so I think there's a debate to be had on just the value of both of those strategies.
Right.
Great.
Well, we are coming up on time, so thank you so much for joining us again, Garett.
Oh, thanks so much. Great being here.
Yeah, no, this was really interesting. You can follow Garett on Twitter, Garett Jones, 1R, 2Ts. And the book we were talking about today is The Hive Mind. Last time we focused on the culture transplant, and Garett has also written 10% Less Democracy, which would be interesting to talk about some other time. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, great. I had a great time again and glad to come back.
Awesome.
Thank you.